Psychoanalytic theory functions under the assumption that mental processes are primarily governed by the pleasure principle. This principle suggests that psychological processes tend to originate from a state of discomfort or tension and seek paths that lead to a reduction in this tension, typically resulting in the avoidance of pain or the attainment of pleasure. When analyzing psychic processes within this framework, psychoanalytic theory introduces an economic perspective, considering not only the dynamic aspects but also the economic element. This approach, which considers pleasure and pain in relation to the quantity of excitation present in the psychic life, is termed metapsychological. While our ascension of the pleasure principle is not grounded in any specific philosophical system, we acknowledge the potential value of philosophical or psychological theories that could provide insight into the nature of pleasure and pain. However, the complexity of these phenomena makes them challenging. Thus, we approach them with an open mind, recognizing the need for flexible hypotheses. Freud's analysis suggests that pleasure corresponds to a decrease in the quantity of excitation, while pain corresponds to an increase. However, we do not propose a simple relationship between the intensity of feelings and corresponding changes. Instead, the amount of diminution or increase over time plays a crucial role. The pleasure principle is closely linked to the principle of constancy, which posits that the psychic apparatus strives to maintain the quantity of excitation as low as possible or at least constant. Any factors that increase excitation are perceived as contrary to the function of the psyche and are experienced as painful. Thus, the principle of constancy is inferred from equations, necessitating the assumption of the pleasure principle. However, it is important to note that the pleasure principle does not always dictate the course of psychic processes. While there is a strong tendency toward pleasure, other forces or conditions may oppose it, leading to outcomes that do not align with the pleasure tendency. Despite this, the pleasure principle remains a significant aspect of psychic life. One common challenge to the pleasure principle is the reality principle, which asserts the postponement of satisfaction and the endurance of pain in the pursuit of long term goals, particularly those related to self preservation. Conflicts within the psychic apparatus, particularly during ego development, can lead to painful experiences due to the repression of certain instincts. External factors such as perceived unsatisfied instincts can also contribute to painful experiences. The reaction to these factors may be guided by either the pleasure principle or the reality principle, depending on the circumstances. Initially, the focus was on interpreting the unconscious aspects of the patient's mind, synthesizing these components and conveying them at the appropriate time. Psychoanalysis was primarily viewed as an interpretative art. However, it became evident that this approach alone did not achieve therapeutic success. Subsequently, efforts turned toward the patient to corroborate these reconstructions through their own recollections. This phase emphasized uncovering the patient's resistances, bringing them to their attention, and using human influence, often through transference, to help the patient relinquish these barriers. Nevertheless, it became increasingly apparent that merely bringing the unconscious into consciousness was not wholly achievable through this method. Patients often could not recall all repressed material, potentially missing its essential aspects, leading to doubts regarding the accuracy of the presented conclusions. Instead, patients tended to re experience repressed content in their current lives rather than recalling it as part of their past. This re experience frequently involved fragments of infantile sexuality, particularly related to the Oedipus complex, played out within the transference relationship with the analyst. This phase marked a transition from the initial neurosis to a new one termed the transference neurosis. Understanding the repetition compulsion, a phenomenon prevalent in the psychoanalytic treatment of neurotics, requires dispelling the notion of resistance emanating directly from the unconscious. The unconscious or repressed material offers no resistance to therapeutic efforts but seeks release either through conscious awareness or through real actions. Resistance in therapy arises from higher levels of the psyche, stemming from the ego, which originally enforced repression. Therefore, it is more accurate to contrast the coherent ego with the repressed rather than conscious with the unconscious. The resistance originating from the conscious and preconscious ego serves the pleasure principle, aiming to avoid the discomfort that would accompany the release of repressed material. Psychoanalytic efforts focus on appealing to the reality principle to allow entry for those painful feelings. However, the repetition compulsion driven by repressed elements presents a new and intriguing aspect. It revives past experiences that contain no potential for pleasure, reflecting loss, failure, and painful affective situations from early childhood. These experiences, marked by disappointment and distress, are reenacted in therapy despite their inherently unpleasant nature, suggesting a powerful compulsion to repeat. Psychoanalysis reveals that the phenomena observed in the transference with neurotics can also be observed in the lives of normal individuals. These patterns give the impression of a predetermined fate, suggesting a demonic trait in their destiny. Psychoanalysis views such life histories as largely self imposed and influenced by childhood experiences. The compulsion expressed in these is similar to the repetition compulsion seen in neurotics, even though these individuals may not display overt neurotic symptoms. For example, some people consistently experience the same endings in their relationships or encounter recurring themes in their lives, such as being betrayed by friends or experiencing ingratitude from those they have helped. Others may repeatedly invest authority in others only to later overthrow it and replace it with new authority figures. Similarly, some individuals find their romantic relationships follow the cases and ultimately end in a predictable manner. While we expect such repetitive patterns in cases where individuals actively participate in shaping their experiences, it is more striking when they seem to passively undergo these experiences without exerting any influence. For instance, there is the story of a woman who married three successive husbands, each of whom fell ill shortly after marriage, requiring her to nurse them until their deaths. These observations lead to the assumption of a repetition compulsion in psychic life, which operates beyond the pleasure principle. This compulsion is evident in various phenomena, including the dreams of trauma patients and the play behavior of children. While the origins and functions of this repetition compulsion are not fully understood, it appears to be a primitive and instinctive force that influences human behavior. Psychoanalytic speculation also delves into the nature of consciousness and its relationship to psychic processes. Consciousness is considered a specialized function of the psyche, distinct from other psychic systems. It is associated with the perception of external stimuli and internal feelings of pleasure and pain. The system responsible for consciousness, termed WBW, is situated on the boundary between outer and inner experiences. Consciousness involves the reception of external stimuli and the formation of memory traces, which are permanent alterations in other psychic systems. However, in the system BW itself, excitation processes do not leave lasting traces, but instead result in the phenomenon of becoming conscious and then vanish. This unique aspect of the BW system suggests that consciousness arises in response to stimuli from the outer world and is intimately connected with its position in the psyche. The living organism, conceived as a sensitive vesicle, is equipped with a protective barrier against external stimuli. This barrier is a fraction of external stimuli to penetrate while shielding the deeper layers of the psyche from overwhelming stimulation. Sense organs serve as specialized structures for receiving specific stimuli while providing additional protection against excessive stimulation. Traumatic experiences involve the breach of the barrier against stimuli, leading to a flood of excitation into the psychic apparatus. The pleasure principle is temporarily overridden as the psyche mobilizes its energy to cope with the overwhelming stimulus. The process of binding this excessive energy is crucial for restoring balance and preventing further disruption to psychic. It can be tentatively suggested that ordinary traumatic neurosis stems from a significant breach in the barrier against stimuli. This perspective harkens back to the traditional notion of shock, which emphasizes the direct impact of external forces. However, this view contrasts with a more contemporary understanding that contributes the etiological significance of traumatic neurosis to psychological factors such as fear and perceived threat to life. Yet, these divergent viewpoints are not necessarily irreconcilable. In psychoanalytic theory, traumatic neurosis is viewed as distinct from the simplistic shock theory. Rather than focusing solely on physical injury to nervous structures, psychoanalysis considers the breach of the psychic barrier against stimuli and the subsequent challenges faced by the individual. It remains relevant in this context, indicating a failure of the apprehension mechanism to adequately prepare for incoming stimuli. This lack of preparation, coupled with insufficient charging of receptive systems, render the individual unable to effectively process and regulate the influx of excitation. Therefore, the consequences of breaching the protective barrier become more pronounced. Dreams experienced by individuals with traumatic neurosis often revisit the traumatic event, but they do not serve the typical function of wish fulfillment. Instead, they may present attempts to regain control over stimuli by fostering apprehension, which was lacking during the traumatic experience. These dreams shed light on a function of the psyche that operates independently of the pleasure principle, suggesting an earlier origin than the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. This recognition challenges the principle that dreams primarily serve as wish fulfillment mechanisms. While anxiety dreams and punishment dreams fit into this category, dreams associated with traumatic neurosis do not. They instead follow a repetition compulsion which to recreate and confront repressed experiences. This function of dreams predates the dominance of the pleasure principle and highlights the complex interplay between psychological mechanisms in processing traumatic events. It raises the question of whether these dreams, driven by the need to bind dramatic scenes, can occur outside the context of psychoanalysis. The affirmative answer suggests that these dreams are not exclusively to therapy but are inherent to the psychical processes involved in coping with trauma. In considering war neurosis, beyond the mere timing of their onset, it is plausible to view them as traumatic neuroses that are exacerbated by underlying ego conflicts. This insight clarifies the observation that severe physical injuries occurring simultaneously with the trauma reduce the likelihood of neurosis, as it can be understood in light of psychoanalytic research. Firstly, mechanical concussion is recognized as a source of sexual excitation, and secondly, a concurrent bodily injury can influence the distribution of libido. Mechanical trauma may unleash a surge of sexual excitation due to its disruptive nature, especially in the absence of adequate psychological preparation. However, the bodily injury occurring concurrently might mitigate this effect by absorbing excess excitation through narcissistic overcharging of the injured area. This interplay illustrates the intricate dynamics between physical trauma, sexual excitation, and the protective mechanisms of the psyche. Moreover, the absence of protective barrier in the sensitive cortical layer against internal stimuli suggests that transmissions from within the body hold significant economic importance. These inner excitations stemming from instinctual forces can lead to disturbances comparable to traumatic neurosis. Understanding these instinctual forces is crucial as they represent innate tendencies towards the reinstatement of earlier conditions akin to organic elasticity or inertia in living organisms. This perspective challenges conventional notions of instinct, which are often associated with progress and development. Instead, instincts appear to be fundamentally conservative, striving to return to a former state rather than advancing towards new ones. This regression towards an ancient starting point underscores the influence of external factors in shaping organic development. The goal of all life, according to this view, is to return to the inanimate state, as everything living eventually succumbs to internal causes and returns to the inorganic. The emergence of life from lifeless matter and the subsequent evolution of consciousness may have been driven by forces striving to attain equilibrium and return to a state of non life. This interpretation sheds light on the cyclical nature of life and the profound influence of external forces on its trajectory. The conclusions drawn thus far regarding instincts may initially seem perplexing and contradictory to our preconceived notions. The assertion that all instincts, except for the sexual ones, are geared towards facilitating death stands in stark contrast to the widely accepted belief in self preservation instincts. However, upon closer examination, it becomes evident that the self preservative instincts, such as those driving power and self assertion, serve to prolong life only in a manner specific to the organism's predetermined path towards death. This paradoxical behavior, where the organism fiercely resists influences that could expedite its is characteristic of pure instinctual responses rather than intelligent decision making. The sexual instincts offer a different perspective as they aim not for the restoration of an earlier state but for the preservation and continuation of life. Unlike the self-preservative instincts, which are focused on individual survival, the sexual instincts operate on a broader scale, safeguarding life itself and potentially prolonging it through reproduction. This distinction highlights an oscillating rhythm in the life of organisms. While some instincts drive towards a swift conclusion of life's journey, others pull back at certain points, prolonging the duration of the process. The sexual instincts, in particular, exhibit a conservative nature by preserving life for a longer time and resisting external influences that threaten its continuity. However, these reflections prompt us to question whether our are entirely valid. Is it indeed true that all life must ultimately succumb to internal causes? The notion of a natural death, while comforting, lacks empirical support and has been challenged by biologists. Observations of certain species with remarkably long lifespans suggest that X factors play a significant role in determining the duration of life. The theories put forth by biologists like August Weismann offer intriguing parallels to discussions on instincts. Weismann's distinction between mortal soma and immortal germ plasm aligns with our differentiation between instincts geared towards death and those promoting life's renewal. However, while Weismann's theory applies primarily to multicellular organisms, it sheds light on the adaptive nature of death rather than its inevitability. The concept of natural death among higher organisms does not contribute to our understanding. If death is a relatively recent development in the history of life, then the idea of death instincts dating back to the origins of life on Earth becomes less relevant. Whether multicellular organisms perish due to internal causes like defects in differentiation or metabolic imperfections does not add much to our inquiry. Such a perspective aligns more closely with conventional human views on death compared to the notion of death instincts. The debate surrounding Weismann's assertions has not yielded decisive outcomes. Some attributed death directly to the act of reproduction. Hartman defined death not merely as the appearance of a lifeless body, but as the definitive end of individual development, suggesting that even protozoa experience death coinciding with reproduction, though in a disguised manner. Interest then shifted to experimental tests of the alleged immortality of unicellular organisms. Woodruff's culture of a ciliated infusorium seemed to demonstrate immortality through continuous reproduction of hundreds of generations. However, other researchers such as Maupas and Calkins contradicted this, showing that infusoria eventually weaken and die after numerous divisions unless exposed to certain invigorating stimuli. From these investigations, two significant observations emerge. First, when infusoria have the opportunity to conjugate, they remain exempt from aging, suggesting a rejuvenating effect. Second, it is probable that infusoria die from their own metabolic processes, particularly due to the accumulation of waste products in the environment. However, the relevance of studying natural death in protozoa may be questionable, as their primitive organization might obscure processes present in higher animals. Nevertheless, the resemblance between Weismann's differentiation of soma and germ plasm and the distinction between life instincts and death instincts remains noteworthy. Considering E. Herring's theory of vital processes involving anabolic and catabolic directions, one might speculate whether these correspond to life instincts and death instincts, respectively. This notion echoes Schopenhauer's philosophy, where death is seen as the ultimate outcome of life, while the sexual instinct embodies the will to live. A deeper exploration of the libido theory reveals a progression from a narrow focus on sexual instincts to a broader understanding encompassing ego, libido, and narcissistic tendencies. This evolution suggests the possibility that all instincts may be fundamentally libidinous in nature. However, the dualistic death instincts remain steadfast, contrasting with Jung's monistic interpretation. Despite challenges in analyzing the ego, there is a recognition that libidinous impulses within the ego may be intertwined with other as yet undiscovered ego instincts. While analysis has primarily revealed libidinous impulses, it does not necessarily negate the existence of other instincts. Thus, the conclusion that only libidinous instincts exist is not warranted. Freud's starting point has been the contrast between life instincts and death instincts. Object love itself reveals a second polarity, that of love, tenderness, and hate, aggression. What if we could establish a connection between these two polarities, tracing one back to the other? We have long recognized a sadistic component of the sexual instinct. It can, as we know, become independent and dominate an entire sexual orientation as a perversion. In certain organizational structures that Freud refers to as pregenital, it emerges as a dominant partial instinct. But how do we derive the sadistic impulse which seeks to harm the object from this life-sustaining eros? Could it be that this sadism is essentially a death instinct that is displaced from the ego by the influence of narcissistic libido, manifesting itself only in relation to the object? It then serves the sexual function during the oral stage of libido organization. Possessing the object amorously is equivalent to annihilating it. Later, the sadistic impulse separates and eventually during the genital primacy stage takes on the task of overpowering the sexual object to facilitate sexual intercourse. One might even argue that sadism expelled from the ego guides the libidinal components of instinct, which then seek the object. In cases where the original sadism remains unabated or uncombined, the well-known ambivalence of love-hate in romantic relationships emerges. If this assumption holds true, then we have met the challenge of demonstrating an example of a death instinct, though one that is displaced. However, this conception is far from evident and may give rise to a mystical impression. We risk being suspected of attempting to find a way out of a deadlock at any cost. However, we can defend against this suspicion by pointing out that this assumption is not entirely new. We previously made no deadlock was at hand. Clinical observations compelled us to view masochism, the contemporary aspect of sadism, as a recoil of sadism onto the ego itself. A redirection of the instinct from the object to the ego is essentially equivalent to a redirection from the ego to the object, which is the new idea under consideration. Masochism, the redirection of the instinct toward the self, would then represent a regression to an earlier phase. However, it is important to note that our understanding of masochism requires some returning to the life-sustaining sexual instincts. We have learned from the study of protozoa that the fusion of two individuals without subsequent separation, much like copulation, between two individuals who then separate shortly after, has a rejuvenating effect. Their descendants show no signs of degeneration and appear to have gained the ability to withstand the harmful effects of their own metabolism for longer periods. This observation may serve as a prototype for the effect of sexual intercourse as well. However, how does this fusion of two slightly different cells bring about such a renewal of life? Experiments substituting conjugation among protozoa with chemical or mechanical stimuli allow us to answer this question with some certainty. It occurs through the introduction of new stimulus masses. This aligns closely with the hypothesis that an individual's life process leads, due to internal causes, to the equalization of chemical tensions, that is, to death, while union with a different individual increases these tensions, introducing a new vital differences that must be lived out. This difference between the two individuals must naturally have one or more optima. Our understanding that the dominant tendency of psychic life, perhaps of nerve life altogether, is the struggle for reduction, maintaining a constant level, or removal of inner stimulus tension. The nirvana principle is one of our strongest reasons for believing in the existence of death instincts. However, our argument is still unsettled by the fact that in the case of the sexual instinct, we are unable to demonstrate the characteristic of a repetition, compulsion that initially led us to the concept of death instincts. While the realm of embryonic developmental processes presents many instances of such repetition phenomena, the essential feature of processes driven by the sexual instinct is a fusion of two cells. Only through this fusion is the immortality of living substance among higher life forms ensured. In other words, we must investigate the origin of sexual reproduction and the source of sexual instincts in general, a daunting specialists have not yet solved. One perspective diminishes the allure of the propagation problem by presenting it as part of the growth phenomenon. According to this view, the emergence of sexual reproduction through sexually differentiated germ cells could be seen, in accordance with the sober Darwinian perspective, as a means of preserving and utilizing the advantage of amphimixis resulting from the chance mating of two protozoa. Sex would thus not be of ancient origin, and the powerful instincts aimed at sexual union would merely repeat something that happened by chance and later proved advantageous. However, this viewpoint raises the same question that arose regarding death: whether protozoa possess anything beyond what is observable, and whether we can assume that forces and processes that are only noticeable in higher animals first emerged in more primitive ones. This perspective on sexuality offers little assistance in this regard. An objection to this perspective is that it presupposes the existence of life instincts already operative in the simplest life forms, otherwise conjugation, which opposes the expiration of life and makes dying more difficult, would not have been retained and developed but would have been avoided. Therefore, if we are not to abandon the hypothesis of death instincts, we must associate them with life instincts from the beginning. However, we must admit that we are dealing with an equation with two unknowns. Yet another hypothesis, though fantastic, suggests an explanation, though mythological, for the origin of sexual instincts. This theory, articulated by Plato in his Symposium, through the character Aristophanes, not only addresses the origin of the sexual instinct but also its most significant variations concerning the object. It explains the human nature was originally different from what it is now, and that there were three sexes in current two, male, female, and a third sex that shared equally in the first two. Each human being longed for their own other half, and when they found it, they embraced and sought to become one again. We understand that one of the primary functions of the psychic apparatus is to bind instinctual excitations, replacing the dominating primary process with the secondary process and converting their freely mobile energy charge into a predominantly quiescent state. During this transformation, little attention is paid to the development of pain, but the pleasure principle remains intact. On the contrary, the transformation occurs in service of the pleasure principle. Binding acts as preparation, introducing and securing its dominance. It is crucial to distinguish between function and tendency more sharply than before. The pleasure principle is then seen as a tendency that serves as a specific function, rendering the psychic apparatus free from excitation or maintaining excitation at a constant or minimal level. We cannot definitively conclude either of these conceptions, but we recognize that the function defined in this way aligns with the most universal tendency of all living matter to return to the peace of the inorganic world. We all know from experience that the greatest pleasure, such as that derived from the sexual act, is associated with a temporary alleviation of a heightened state of excitation. However, the binding of instinctual excitation serves as a preparatory function that directs the excitation towards its ultimate discharge-related pleasure. In connection with this, we must consider whether sensations of pleasure and pain can rise from both bound and unbound excitation processes. It is evident that unbound primary processes give rise to much more intense sensations in both directions than bound secondary processes. These primary processes are also the earliest to emerge in mental life, leading us to conclude that if the pleasure principle were not already in action in relation to them, it would not establish itself in later processes. Thus, we arrive at the somewhat complex result that the surge of pleasure manifests with greater intensity at the beginning of psychic life, but restrictions accepting repeated breaches. As one matures, the dominance of the pleasure principle becomes more assured, though it is still subject to limitations like all other instincts. Moreover, the sensations of pleasure, pain, and tension convey inner perceptions to us. The life instincts are more closely associated with our inner. They disrupt peace and bring about states of tension whose resolution is experienced as pleasure. In contrast, the death instincts seem to fulfill their function quietly. The pleasure principle appears to directly serve the death instincts, also guarding against external stimuli perceived as dangers by both types of instincts, particularly focusing on inner increases in stimulation aimed at complicating the task of living. This raises numerous unanswered questions that require patience and readiness to explore further means and opportunities for investigation. In conclusion, we may find solace in the words of a poet regarding the slow progress of scientific knowledge. Whither we cannot fly, we must go limping. The scripture says that